picking up where we left off, and we're going to switch slides. And even though I've done these slides, I don't know, a month or so ago, my attorney is getting me her comments piecemeal, and so Gary will have to switch because the batch that I sent him last night contains the changes that the attorney wanted me to make, including deleting about 6 slides on liquidated damages that she wasn't comfortable with me talking about. So, I don't know, whatever. Okay, we're going to start with receiving, and again, picking up on the issue of contract management. And everything that you do that pertains to a procurement is getting something for a result. And as we said on last Monday, that from the time that there's a decision to procure something, everything should have the specific focus of getting to the end result. And contract management is about, if I can say, 50% planning and putting things in place up front, and about 50% of after you have things up front, then getting what you've already planned for and dealing with things that come up that you weren't anticipating that they would come up. And you have to have both parts. You have to plan to begin with, you have to have things in place to begin with, and you have to manage as well. So you have to have both parts to get a typically successful outcome. So we're going to focus on a lot of the techniques. Okay, let's see. Receiving acceptance of deliverables. Implement the acceptance procedures established in the contract and fleshed out in the work initiation conference. So what we set up before was the fact that you will have certain things in place. You typically should have a work initiation conference because you have this succession of opportunities to try to clarify exactly what your expectations are from vendors and exactly what your understanding is that they are going to provide to you and when they're going to provide to you. And even though sometimes it's amazing where you can get to a work initiation conference and find out there is still lack of understanding if you have gone through a procurement, in particular an evaluated procurement, where you've had multiple opportunities to have discussions and to have written questions and answers, what we call cure letters, and the oral presentation from vendors. And sometimes you can still get to this point and you find out you don't have this exact meeting of what you expect the vendor to do and what they anticipate they're going to do. And one of the things we've said is always better to know sooner than later. So even if you did not get everything out of the way and everything clarified before you get to a work initiation conference, you should repeat the primary deliverables and flesh out various aspects so that even if there's still some misunderstanding, it is identified at that point so that you can start dealing with it at that point. And what we're talking about is you go over the acceptance criteria, what the vendor is supposed to do, and what is going to evidence whether they have done it. And as said last time, lots of times it's very obvious whether a vendor has achieved what they're supposed to do, but sometimes it isn't. And when it isn't so clear, you need to have criteria so both you and the contractor know when it should be construed that they have done what they're supposed to do. And if you don't define this, and if you don't have this criteria, what you do is get into disputes with your vendor. And one of the things that are one of the elementary things of problems with contract management is when instead of you and the vendor cooperatively working to accomplish what you want, is you're fighting the vendor. And so the more you can clarify, the more you can get things out of the way, the more you can be in sync, the more that both of you can focus on the objective to achieve instead of fighting each other. Because it's a waste of your time and their time, but we're more concerned about your time, for you to be trying to hash out and figure out after the fact things that should have been figured out ahead of time. So the acceptance criteria, the procedures, things of this nature, and who is responsible for receiving things, who is responsible for documenting. Another thing I said last Monday is documentation is essential. That I won't say it is useless without documentation to go ahead and try and do contract management, but it is key to try to get implementation if you have to go further, if you have to withhold payment, if you have to try to get termination, if you have to file claims. What counts when you go into the adjudication process is what you have documented. So that is absolutely essential. Let's see. So now we're going to start talking about some things. If you find, even at this stage or at any stage, that you have differing interpretations, what do you do between what you thought vendors were going to offer and what they thought you wanted? And so we're going to say the preferred option is number one. You do a modification to the contract so that both parties clearly have on paper, signed and sealed by both parties, what it is that's supposed to be done. What I'm going to say to you is you don't just let it go on with trying to continue to have this verbal understanding or continually having friction. You try to get it memorialized in writing as to what is the proper understanding. Now, you can go sometimes beyond this, but the preferred thing is you get the understanding so both parties have it. Because another thing I said last time is if you have a 3, 4, 5-year contract, then if you don't have something clarified as soon as possible, it can potentially continue to fester for the entire duration. And this can get worse. Well, the thing that we said happened last time is frequently there are changes of personnel, both within the agency, within the state, and within the contractor. And even if you and your counterpart from the contractor at the very beginning work out some kind of mutual understanding without going ahead and putting it in writing, there's nothing that says over time, as you go on to bigger and better things, or as the contractor changes, or the contractor's bought, that there will cease to be this congenial understanding. And if you have not taken the steps to try to get it clarified in writing, you may simply be delaying where a problem arises. Maybe it doesn't happen initially, but maybe 1 or 2 years down the road, it is a problem because you didn't try to get clarified language up front. So the first step is you try to get mutually agreed language that more accurately reflects the intent of the parties with no changes to the scope of work, because supposedly hopefully both parties did understand the scope of work, and in particular, no changes in what we're paying them. Just get the understanding of what's supposed to be done, and everything else stays the same. That is the preferred way to do it if you've gotten to this point and you still find out that you didn't have this meeting of the minds. Now, what if you can't have the preferred option? Then you go to number 2, and that's where you or the vendor say, wait a minute, either you need to do more, or they say, if you want me to do this, I need more money. And you can potentially do what number 2 says, modify the contract with new, mutually agreed upon language that more accurately states the intent of the parties, but that gives the contractor more or less compensation. Sometimes when you clarify what's to be done, that actually they have to do less. I don't know if that's the typical thing, but sometimes they could do less, sometimes more. Now, if less, then hopefully we ask for some money back, that we don't pay them the same amount of money to do less work. Conversely, if our expectation and the language is eventually written that they end up doing more work, they're typically going to ask for more money. And if it has to come to this, then if both parties agree to this, that there's actual changes from what was understood with all the proper approvals, then that could be the second way to handle this situation. Third, if no language can be agreed upon or the state doesn't agree that more money should be paid, then we can either file a claim against the contractor, which rarely happens. We rarely file claims against contractors because we have this ace in the hole, so to speak. We can hold back payment. And that's the first thing we're going to do if we feel that the vendor isn't performing as we expected them to do. If we hold back money, then what that typically does is if they are really bent out of shape over it, they will file a claim against us, which is 99% of the time what happens. If there's a claim situation, the vendor files it against the state. In fact, up to about maybe 5 years ago, the state could not even file a claim against a contractor. So there had to be a change in the law and the regulation to even allow that to happen back about 5 or 6 years ago. So that's the one thing that could happen. The other thing she said is withhold money and see if they file a claim against us. And the fourth, and this is obviously the least preferred, is if no language can be agreed upon or the state doesn't agree that more money should be paid and we don't want to file a claim against the vendor, what we can do is terminate the contract. Now the question is going to be whether it's a termination for convenience, a termination for default. It depends upon how firm we think, how firm grounds we think we're on for the vendor should have known what they were supposed to be doing. If we feel that they are defaulting with something that clearly they should have known they were to do, then we would terminate for default. If we can't, because of lack of documentation or a lack of clarity on our part, have conviction that we would be upheld with a termination for default, we could terminate for convenience. And we're going to get into those two issues later. Question?
Yes. You explain modification. What is an amendment to a contract?
Amendment, modification, same thing. Same thing.
Question about the claims. Who hears or makes the decision about the claim, whether it's from the state or from the contractor?
Who makes the decision?
Yeah.
Well, the state makes the decision whether they're filing a claim against a contractor. If you have non-performance by a contractor, the first thing you're going to try and do is you go through your normal procedures that we're going to say. We're going to have a remediation plan. We're going to have withholding of money. We might have liquidated damages. We might have various techniques that we try to get compliance. And in the final result, I will say the typical situation, even though I've said it is not typical for us to file claims, typically when we do that, it's well, the only situation I'm aware of is after a contract was already over, that we found out something actually because legislative auditors went in and audited a contract after it was over, like 2 years after the fact, and uncovered circumstances where a vendor wasn't performing from the standpoint of the legislative auditors. And the contract was over. Final payment had been made. We couldn't withhold money anymore. And so now that we have this circumstance identified by the auditors, the only way we could try to get something back from the vendor was to file a claim. But if the contract is still going on, typically the first action in concert with your typically Assistant Attorney General, because if you do withholding of payment, unless it's very obvious while you're doing it, the vendor usually gets a little bit out of shape over that and may file a claim against you. But the bottom line is, if they think that we have done something improper, the vendor does, then they're the ones going to file a claim against us.
Does that come usually to the department head?
A claim will go to the contract manager.
Okay.
And in fact, we're going to deal with claims today. So we'll tell you what the procedure is. And I have been involved in, that I can remember, because this just happened within the past year, one claim against a vendor. And it was because the auditors detected something after it was over. I have been involved in a number of claims where vendors came and wanted money from us, and I'm sure you have also.
The majority of the claims that I've seen have come in construction contracts. But at the end of the day, there's just a difference of opinion of what the acceptance was or what the standard was. The state's withholding money and the contractor files a claim to get that money that he feels he's owed.
About a year and a half ago, there was a seminar by the Board of Public Works, a procurement seminar, and at one of the breakout sessions, there were two members of the Board of Contract Appeals that did like a 50-minute presentation on words to the wise, so to speak, of what state procurement people should do to try to avoid protest claims, things of this nature. And the one thing they said that I remember, and in fact, I think this is one of the, at the end of this class, we have it as one of the appendices, was it all comes down to money. That, and their words of the wisdom were, number one, it always comes down to money, and number two, it can always be worked out one way or the other.
Most claims are settled. There's a compromise. It's not normally a give or take. It's normally a compromise.
Since a claim is a situation where, again, the two parties have supposedly differing views on something, some aspect of contract performance that has a monetary impact. And so then what you have to do is look at how firm is your position. How confident are you that if the other side pushes the envelope and files a claim, and you can deny a claim, but then they can appeal your denial to the Board of Contract Appeals. And so number one is going to be a lot of hassle from the vendor standpoint, but from our selfish standpoint, our perspective, to try to defend and prosecute the claim. And so are we comfortable, number one, that we want to go through the hassle, the effort to adjudicate this claim, and how comfortable are we're going to win? And obviously, that's a very strong motivation to try to work out something mutually agreeable, that it avoids continuing hassle and avoids the possibility that you'll end up losing. And that depends on how well you have stated things to begin with, documented, and done your job as to which way this is going to be, and how much you're willing to give up to a vendor to try to avoid those other possibilities. You may.
Joel said that this would normally occur after a contract, and perhaps it's been identified by the legislative auditors, and that's absolutely correct. However, I have had a couple of situations where we've had some very astute contract managers and programs that had been able to identify vendor deficiency severe vendor deficiency during the operation of one of their contracts. And one of the people happens to be here that was involved in this. They identified that, and we put a claim in to the vendor, and it was a much more extensive claim than money. It was, you fix it. You caused it, you fix it. And we're not paying you any more for it, but we expect you to do the right thing. And worked out.
And I guess from what you just said, the standpoint is there wasn't enough money to withhold, perhaps?
Oh, no, we were doing that too. We were withholding.
But it went beyond that.
Yeah, it was a corrective action. It was the implementation of a corrective action plan that caused the vendor actually to spend many times the value of what they were receiving in order to do the correction. But the problem, they were and are a conscientious vendor, and they had a bad actor who was doing things in the processing of certain data that they should not have been doing. We found that out before the vendor before vendors' supervisory or internal controls found it out. So the program was able to identify it, correct it by taking really forceful and immediate action.
And getting ahead of ourselves, what we're really talking about is the subject of damages. And when you file a claim, or a vendor files a claim against the state, what they're saying is that they have been damaged by the non-performance of the other party to the contract. And so the claim is identifying what those damages are. And we're going to talk about damages. We're going to talk about the fact that to the extent that you can prove damages exist, and I emphasize prove, then you can collect damages under general contract law. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about shortly is liquidated damages, which are a shortcut to actual damages. And if you have liquidated damages, you can only collect up to the extent of the liquidated damages. But I probably should finish this before I get into the next topic. But that's what you did. Because the value from what you said was more than what the money would be for the value of the contract, multiples, you have to file a claim. If you don't, just withholding the amount of money isn't going to make you whole for the damages that were caused. Okay, let's see. So you go through these 1, 2, 3, 4 if necessary. If there is differing interpretations, but the ideal is you try to avoid differing interpretation. And I won't say that if you get into this situations, it in and of itself proves that there was inadequate effort prior to this point, but that might be a very strong reason why you're getting into this that because there was skimping somewhere in the procurement process, you're now paying for it. That's something we have said in the overview class, in the procure class, maybe in the planning class, but that in particular, while you're going through planning and especially the procure stage, if you don't do things correctly, very often if you flash forward 6 months, a year, 2 years into the future and try to anticipate the impact of not answering questions, not doing oral presentations, not doing clarifications with vendors, not vetting their capability if it's a sealed bid procurement, you may get to the point in the future that you wish you were back at that point in time and had the opportunity again to do these things to try to avoid what you are now encountering when you're trying to manage a contract. So one of the things I've said many times, the old adage of pay me now or pay me later, you need to do things in the procure stage in particular and as early as possible in the perform stage so that you try to avoid problems later. You try to minimize the problems, you try to avoid them as much as possible. And you try to make decisions from the standpoint of, if I take an extra 2 or 3 days or an extra amount of effort right now before I make a decision of who the vendor is we're going to select, or to try to get total understanding of exceptions from vendors, things of that nature, am I going to potentially save a whole lot of headache later by doing that? And if you think that a relatively minor amount of effort on the front end is going to save a lot of problems on the back end, you should do it. And one of the things we say in overview, you always have this dynamic, this tension between get it done now. We don't have time to do discussions. We don't have time to go back and get clarification from vendors. And that's what I hear all the time. We don't have time to do this. We have to get to an award. And what I continually say to the people that are saying that to me is, let's just slow down, let's think about this. What are the potential ramifications if we don't take this time? And if you make the contrast between potentially a day or a couple days right now and saving multitudes of headaches and potentially money later, usually the decision should be we'll take the extra time now to try to get it right. Because what we're going to go over in this class with example after example of things that have gone wrong is the fact that things go wrong. And usually you can trace the fact they went wrong to something that wasn't done in either planning or procuring before you've gotten to the contract management stage. And that's what we're warning you of what those pitfalls are, so hopefully you'll be forewarned and can try to avoid them in the future because you've been told that these are the things that could happen. Okay, let's see, work plan monitoring. So one of the key focuses of contract management is to manage contractors. Know what they're doing, monitor their performance. We're going to talk about techniques, various things that you can do to monitor their performance. And we're going to talk a lot about that. So let's see, verification. This is what work plan monitoring is. It's verification that performance can be expected as scheduled. You're getting what you wanted when you wanted it. Cost will be as anticipated. Not just that you're getting what you wanted when you wanted it, but you're not paying more for it. That vendors sometimes will try to get this cost creep in there. Resources are being applied at originally predicted levels, which goes to number one in particular. The quality of the service will be consistent with the specifications, and payments to the contractor are deserved. And these are interrelated situations. The most critical factor is monitoring performance is understanding the requirements well enough to determine whether the contractor is performing in accordance with the contract. We got to know what it is that we expect the vendor to do. That seems elementary, and in many cases it is elementary, but sometimes it is not as easy as it seems. That goes back to what are our criteria, what are our acceptance standards, etc., and we have to know what it is the vendor's supposed to do. Knowing what they're doing is only half the equation. We have to know what they're supposed to be doing, not just what they are doing. And We need to ensure that the contractor fully understands what constitutes acceptable performance. Again, both parties have to know what it is they're supposed to be doing. This is a recommendation of something that you could implement. Another thing that I said in the first class was the purpose of this class is to basically give you the worst case scenario, to take a very large, complicated contract and basically tell you everything that you could do to try to get performance in virtually any circumstance. Typically, you will not use everything we are saying for every contract that you have. The simpler it is, the fewer things you're going to implement. Hopefully you'll do some action to try to get performance for any contract, but you'll try to make it commensurate. What your efforts are going to be commensurate with the value and the complexity of the contract that you have. So we're going to say things from continually from the orientation of looking at a very complex, very expensive contract, and you have to make your decision about whether you're going to use these things for any particular contract or procurement you're involved with. So, having said that, the issue of a tickler system. So one of the recommendations for a major contract is that you establish a tickler system with automatic reminders of the due dates of significant deliverables. And I say automatic, that you, well, let me just read this before I say too much. This is most strongly recommended for contracts with non-recurring deliverables, i.e. they're doing something different. They're doing something this week, something different 2 weeks from now, something different 2 months from now, rather than housekeeping or food service or something like that, where essentially they're doing the same thing day after day after day. You will have monitoring for recurring contracts, but there's more reason to have tickler system for deliverables on non-recurring contracts because it's not the same thing. And you have to know what different achievement is supposed to happen at what point in time. So, non-recurring deliverables, especially contracts that may not have required routine reporting, i.e. if you don't have weekly meetings, weekly reports, monthly meetings, so that you're supposedly getting information from that means, this might be more important to implement. But a tickler system can be a valuable assist for any type of contract as a backup or fail-safe supplement to regular reporting and to the contract compliance checklist. So it can be either your primary means to let you know what has to be done or a supplemental means to reports, meetings, things of that nature. Tickler feature as an adjunct to a contract compliance checklist provides an active compliance tool to what otherwise might be a passive or static tool. Active versus passive. We talked about active and passive on last Monday in terms of how you do monitoring. Now we're going to use those same terminologies to further talk about this tickler system. A passive compliance tool requires the contract manager or other agency personnel to refer to the checklist on a daily or periodic basis to determine when a contract deliverable is due, i.e. you have to go into your files, you have to go into something and look up when something is due. That's what I call passive. That if I have to come into work and once a week I'm going to open my file and go through my contract compliance checklist and see what is the next deliverable a vendor has to do, I have to actually do an action to do that. So, for better or worse, I call that a passive activity. Whereas active compliance tool grabs the attention of monitoring personnel even if they don't refer to the checklist, even if you don't go into the file to find out what is due next, something's going to come and basically tap you on the shoulder or knock you over the head, depending on the circumstances, and say, hey, something is coming due from the contractor. So, of course, the issue is so that you don't miss it, so that you know it's coming up and you can be going after the vendor to try to make sure they're doing it. This tickler system should be set up on the contract manager's computer so that each day, and maybe not literally each day, but so that each, as they turn on the computer, an appropriate reminder pops up. So if it is programmed properly, you can program it so every day a reminder will come up, or X number of days, X number of weeks before a particular deliverable, something's going to pop up on your computer that's going to give you a message, a reminder. Something has to be done by the contractor by this date. So it's right there for you to see it and be reminded that something is supposed to happen. If there is not routine required reporting on the progress of a contract with non-recurring deliverables, establish a tickler system with reminders of significant deliverable due dates. Again, usually you should have reporting, you should have reports, you should have meetings to know what's going on. So hopefully this is in addition to those, not instead of, but either way, you can have it so that, as I just mentioned, it's going to remind you before significant deliverables come up. This system should be programmed to prompt a given number of days in advance of deliverable due dates, with more advanced notice of major deliverables and less notice for minor deliverables. Something of a fail-safe nature that just has to happen. Maybe you're going to have a notice starting 6 months ahead of time or 3 months ahead of time that this deliverable is coming up. And then maybe until you go in and check off that it's completed, it's going to start popping up at more frequent intervals to remind you that this deliverable is now getting shorter and shorter in due in the future. And all this should be programmed in advance so you have these active reminders that something is coming up and you should be paying attention to it. Even better, provide prompts at multiple time frames as reminders to check contract status at various times. Let's see. Adequate advance notice should provide the opportunity to ensure the vendor is progressing as it should be. As a tickler notice pops up at progressively shorter time frames for the same deliverable, the contract manager should pay more attention if there is lack of performance. If, and this is probably in the next slide, let me get to the next slide so I don't have to repeat myself. If the vendor is not progressing, adequate advance notice provides the opportunity to take action to require the vendor to get back on schedule. So, for example, if a tickler system is set up to provide prompts for a given major deliverable on a monthly basis starting 3 months before the deliverable due date, so you're going to get a tickler notice at 3 months beforehand. And if you don't go in and indicate that the deliverable has been accomplished, then it can come up with 2 months ahead of time with notice. It can come up with 1 month ahead of time with the notice, and you can actually have it more frequently than monthly. It can be 3 months, 2 months, and then on a 2-week basis, 2.5 months, 2 months, then on a weekly basis, all to continually get your attention. So hopefully you'll be taking action with the vendor to try to make sure they're going to perform. As each time frame passes without the vendor completing the deliverable or showing firm evidence that the time frame will be met, excuse me, the contract should require greater effort by the vendor to assure that the time frame will be met. And something else I mentioned, when they make references to slides on this, since we continually change this, like I said, we just deleted 6 slides last night, these numbers don't match up. So you basically have to ignore this. When we have a final version, they will match up. And hopefully you will have access to the final version when we're done, and you can get the right references, but at least for now, they're not. And I think actually we mentioned this on the next slide, which is not 228. Example, 1 month prior to the due date without completion or firm evidence of likely completion. These are the things that can automatically be built into the contract that you only have to implement. So for instance, at the 1 month point, if we don't have an action, we can say that instead of reports and meetings being monthly, they will now switch to weekly. Or we can have in place that we will require a formal remediation plan from the vendor, with them submitting it within a given time frame as specified in your contractor solicitation document, and with that being approved by the agency for them to go ahead and try to indicate they're going to have performance. The vendor should be reminded of liquidated damages or other compliance-focused provisions of the contract, told of any additional actions the agency plans to or is seriously considering implementing, such as, and you typically are not going to do threats of termination right away, but sometimes it's appropriate to let them know that these things do exist and you are at least thinking about them. For partial termination, because a termination can be either complete or partial, and we will talk about termination later. We talked about, I think on last Monday, that one of the things you can tell them is that if they are not performing and you are documenting this non-performance, since we have this clause that we recommend agencies use, that whenever there's an evaluated procurement, that vendors are supposed to list all contracts they've had with any state agency for the past 5 years. That's a clause we recommend that any agency use for any evaluated procurement. And if vendors are required to give their 5 years worth of state activity, and they give that list and they say they have done work for Department of the Environment and Department of General Services and Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and you are, let's say, the Department of Human Resources, and you know that this vendor has done work for 3 other agencies, then typically you will go to those 3 agencies and ask, how has the vendor done? And if the report you get from those agencies is, well, they didn't do very well, they missed deliverables, we had to be after them all the time, that typically is going to have an impact on your evaluation of whether they should get a future award. And so that's something that you could remind them, that if they're not performing your contract, they have the potential that that information will be shared with other agencies. It may impact their ability to win future contracts for other agencies, and it definitely should have an impact on whether they will win future business for the same agency. So these are things that you can say to them. We did say on Monday, last Monday, that you need to have some fairness with this issue of providing information, that you need to give the vendor the ability to have a rebuttal if you have a negative evaluation. But if they're flat out not performing, there's not a whole lot they can do to rebut your statement that they're not performing. So these are things you can remind them of. All right, does everyone have this nice little cartoon in front of them? I'm going to ask you to look at that a moment, because we're going to make this into an exercise. So let me read it. Suddenly, a heated exchange took place between the king and the moat contractor. And you can see there's that heated exchange right in the middle between apparently the king with the little crown there and apparently the moat contractor while the workers are going about their business. Now, exercise, inadequate specifications. Using only the preceding cartoon, which again you should all have in front of you, and forgetting what you know about moats, because I presume we all know what a moat is supposed to do. But if you look only at that cartoon and you didn't know this was the first time a moat had ever been created, so there's no common knowledge of what a moat is supposed to look like, can you think of a way that specifications might have been worded that would make what the contractor did compliant with those specifications? Yes?
Well, it looks like they may have just stated that the moat had to be within so many feet of the wall, but they should have specified within so many feet outside the wall.
So what she is saying is, if the specifications said, and I don't know whether that's 6 feet, 10 feet, whatever, that a ditch 6 feet wide, 6 feet deep shall be dug 10 feet away from the wall, is that presumably compliant with those type of specifications? If that's what the specifications said? Okay. Going the wrong way. How could the wording, and assuming that that is a plausible explanation for why the moat contractor did what apparently the moat contractor did, how could the wording have been changed to reflect what the king obviously wanted? So what would you have said differently, knowing that that is a potential outcome to merely saying, dig a ditch 10 feet away from the wall, equal all the way around at 10-foot distance? How could it have been said differently?
Outside the wall?
Pardon me?
Outside the wall?
Outside the wall. Obviously, there's an outside and an inside, and if you said 10 feet outside the wall, then that would preclude someone properly digging the ditch 10 feet inside the wall. What are some other things you might have done? Your favorite answer. What is the potential? Let's see. What are we? Pre-bid conference, something like that. If you would have had what we call functional requirements, if you would have simply stated the purpose of the moat. The purpose of the moat is to try to prevent opposing armies or whomever from gaining access to the wall.
And a work initiation conference.
Work initiation conference, but that would be after award. Pre-bid conference, a blueprint. Simply giving them something in this situation which showed what the intent was. These are all ways that you can help prevent what should be obvious. But even though what should be obvious, if it comes down to what did you specify? If what you specified was 10 feet equidistant from the wall, then a vendor theoretically who did that might be construed to be compliant. And the question is, oh, we're about to change. I guess this is a good point to change. And one of the other things that was up there, if there was, let's say, a sizable price difference between vendor A and vendor B, vendor A being the one who won the contract and the one who we now have this dispute with, could inadequate specifications have been the reason for a substantial price difference? And how would that be? What if vendor A, we now see vendor A was assuming properly or improperly that it was going to be dug inside the wall, and if vendor B had given a price to do the moat outside the wall, could that have accounted for a substantial price difference?
Sure, 20-30%.
Because there's a lot more distance if you're doing it outside the wall than if you're doing it inside the wall. This is a real simple example, but this hopefully can illustrate that simple things that you can do can help avoid this situation where you have an obvious dispute. And the fact there was a heated discussion means the contractor is saying, I did what the spec said. And the king is saying, presumably, perhaps something as ridiculous as, I don't care what the spec said, you should have known what you should have done. And sometimes they should have known, but what it comes down to is what can you prove? And so we talked in planning, and we will talk a little more in this class about ambiguity. And if something was, in fact, we talked about it on Monday, if there is a hidden ambiguity, what is called a latent ambiguity, the interpretation of the vendor is the interpretation that's going to be upheld if a claim is filed. So if there is something that you don't find out until you're in contract management, all right. We're going beyond that. If you don't find out until you're in contract management that you have a dispute, then it gets to the issue of was it a latent, was it an ambiguity versus no, it's clear what the vendor should be doing, they're simply not doing it, or was it a different meeting of the minds, not a meeting of the minds, but different interpretation, and if it is, was it because of ambiguity, and if it gets to whether it's a obvious ambiguity versus a hidden ambiguity. If it's hidden, if that's the final interpretation, what the vendor said they interpreted is what is going to prevail, so we're not going to get what we wanted. If it's an obvious ambiguity, the interpretation of the state will prevail. And one of the things we have said is ambiguity is bad. You should try your utmost to avoid ambiguity, particularly when that's obvious. Don't have things that are questionable.
It seems like it's 10 slides different.
10 slides different.
I think right next.
It started 10 slides early.
So that's good. So this, you're good.
Yes.
We're good.
when I did this, I noticed for some reason I got the footer repeated, but since that was the ones that we already had slides on, I didn't worry about correcting that. I don't know why it happens. All right, moving forward. We're now into the second group of slides that you have the handout for now.
Anybody need a set of slides for the second group?
Problems with the contractor. Hopefully you try to avoid this, but if you can't, then what do? What to do if the performance monitoring process uncovers an apparent deficiency. So again, you have to monitor to know whether the vendor is performing. So you do your monitoring and you now discover, no, the vendor is not performing. What do? We're going to first address what we call contractually provided remedies. These are things that are actually in your specifications, in your contract, that you can avail yourselves of. And there's two typical ones. Liquidated damages. Well, certainly not all contracts have liquidated damages, but for every contract you can withhold payment if the payment is not deserved by the vendor. And there's two types of withholding, and one of them needs to be built into the specifications, the other one does not need to be built into the specifications. The withholding, the first is if they don't do the work, you shouldn't pay them. If they send in an invoice, you don't pay the invoice, etc., if they haven't done the work. That's the obvious one. The second one, where you do need some kind of specific statement in your specifications, is if you're going to have what is called retainage or withholding, that you specifically say that a given amount of each invoice, or each invoice for each particular aspect of the deliverable, is not going to be paid. It's going to be held back or retained. And you hold it back or retain it to help assure that you get the entire product. You do this typically when you're making payments and the payments are made because you feel the vendor needs some cash flow, but you're making payments for something that you cannot enjoy the value of unless everything is completed. And on Monday we had the example if you're doing construction, and I think we said you might have payment points of when the framework, the outside framework is done, when the plumbing is put in, when the heating system is put in. So maybe we will pay money for each of those activities, but we cannot in and of themselves enjoy the outside framework, the plumbing, the heating, if the whole building isn't done. If there's no floors, no ceilings, no outside walls, yes, there's something there, but we still cannot enjoy the building and occupy it and use it until the whole building is done. So maybe we will not pay the full value of what it costs to put up the outside framework or the plumbing or the heating. Maybe we will pay 80%, 90%, retain some amount of money so that the vendor has to complete the job to get the amount we have held back. So those are things that you might do if they are built into the contract. Liquidated damages and retainage withholding are discussed in planning. The other thing that is a contractually provided remedy, because it's a mandatory state clause, is termination for default, and we will discuss that later. Contractual remedies continued. Solicitations and contracts should contain requirements for identified nominally non-monetary actions to be automatically triggered if specified contractor performance levels are not achieved. And I mentioned this a little bit in planning. Maybe I mentioned this last Monday. But what this means is that you have said in your specifications, that if certain actions are not done by certain time frames, that only because of the failure to meet a particular time frame will certain things either now be required or be required at greater levels, greater frequency, greater something than previously. So either it's something that wasn't there and the vendor wouldn't have to do if they were performing as required, or it's something they did have to do before, but now they're going to have to do more. And what that does is, number one, it has a greater level, when I say nominally non-monetary. Having meetings, reports, audits, things of this nature are not the same as saying, pay me $100 or $1,000 or something like that. So they're not, from that standpoint, monetary in nature. But from a vendor standpoint, time is money. The effort of people is money. If they now have to start having weekly meetings and having 2 or 3 people come to an hour or so meeting, that's time that they didn't potentially build into their price, time they're going to have to pay because we have put this in our specifications, so they're now supposed to do it as a deliverable, and it's incurring them money. Nothing they're going to bill for, nothing we're going to pay for, but it's incurring expense from them. Additional reports is an expense, additional audits is an expense, survey expense, inspections expense, etc. Or the things that will have an actual cost, if we now have a bond or insurance or liquidated damages that have been specified in advance to only kick in under certain circumstances, that if they performed they wouldn't have, now they have to pay actual money to get more bonds or increase the value of the bonds, same with insurance, same with liquidated damages. So these are things that we can have, and you can say to the vendor, now you know if you're not going to perform, here are these remedies that are already built into the specifications. And if you go 2 more weeks without doing what you're supposed to do, here's what's going to kick in. We're going to now start having weekly meetings, and you now have to do weekly reports and things of this nature. And it's going to be an expense to them. So they typically won't want to do that. The new requirement for increased frequency of such actions is intended to show that the contractor is exerting additional effort to attain the required level of contract compliance. However, an ancillary consequence is to cause the contractor to incur greater expenses to perform these enhanced actions. They don't want to spend the money, so hopefully they will do what they need to do to avoid this. And that's what we want to begin with. Just do what we contracted with you to do. And then neither one of us has to worry about these things. Presumably, the contractor will be motivated to achieve compliance for its own sake and avoid the additional expense of these actions. Let's see. So that's something that you can do and you can build in. And one of the key things that I'm doing by bringing these up to you is giving you things to think about, so that when you're doing planning for procurements in the future and for contracts in the future, you can go back and think of these things and think of, now do I want to bring some of these into play? Maybe you've never done these before, but now that you know that these are potential actions, maybe you can build them into your procurements in the future so that you have them available as a tool to try to get contract compliance. We're going to go on to now the subject of liquidated damages to a slight degree. And we said this is a contractually provided remedy if this is built into your contract to begin with. And we did talk about a little bit before about what liquidated damages are, and we will talk a little bit later, but let's just go through this. When a contract has liquidated damages provisions, and we'll explain that later, there may be a question of when to apply these provisions. Some contract managers are reluctant to apply such damages even when the circumstances exist to trigger the damages. And I've created these slides because I've gone through these situations. And I've gone through it with contract managers that I've been involved with, so I'm now telling you my words of wisdom of what you should do or not do relative to liquidated damages. And I have had situations where contract managers would, when it's obvious that a vendor hasn't done something and we had liquidated damages, and the only thing that should have happened was the contract manager should have then taken the value of the liquidated damage and either billed it to the vendor or simply deducted that value from payment. But instead, the contract manager would say, well, I really don't want to do it because I don't want to get the vendor mad at me. I mean, that would be really a bad thing if I go ahead and invoke these damages, because we wouldn't be friends anymore. And I've had contract managers that, even though liquidated damages are in the contract, they don't want to invoke them. And what I am saying is, let's see, report of these persons believe that the contractor should be given one or more warnings that the damages will apply the next time. No, I don't want to do it now. I'm going to do it the next time. I'm going to give them a warning now, and if they do it again, then I'm going to invoke it. And essentially what they're doing is they're waiving the liquidated damage. And my statement in another slide is you shouldn't do this. And I'll wait till the next slide to emphasize that. There were going to be like 2 other slides before we got to the point, but they were deleted while I'm still in negotiation with my lawyer as to whether we can bring them back in or how we're going to say it. But relative to liquidated damages, one thing I will say, there is a mandatory clause that happens to be in 2107-0113 that is entitled Delays and Extension of Time. And this clause has the provision that if a vendor has not met a time frame, and it is determined by the state that the reason why the vendor has not met a required time frame is because of an excusable delay, something beyond their control, something caused by other vendors or strikes or weather or things of this nature, then it is permissible to not hold them to that time frame because the delay is excusable.
Blizzard of 2000.
Blizzard of 2000, the 2 or 3. The one, what do we have, 50 inches in 2 days or 3 days or something, plus in December of '09 we had another 20-some inches. Yes, those are reasons why maybe a vendor didn't meet a very simplistic time frame. Maybe they didn't deliver. In fact, I do know an example. For the prisons, we're working with the Department of Public Safety and Corrections with their pharmacy procurement for the 25,000 inmates of the correctional system. And deliveries are required every day for the pharmaceuticals. And in discussing with public safety, we went into the issue of should there be liquidated damages for deliveries, and talking about have there ever been any instances where a vendor has not delivered. And first they said nope, the vendor always delivers, and then they said, well, there was last February when with the 50-some inches they missed a day, and so they did not invoke any damages in that situation because obviously that's something, if you can't get out on the roads and it's a physical impossibility, how do you hold that against the vendor? But that is not a typical situation. So what this says is that you have the right not to apply any sanction, whether it's liquidated damages, whether it's withholding, whatever, no matter what it is, if you interpret there is an excusable delay that is beyond the control of the vendor. So other than this, then the typical answer is, and this goes further and says if the contract manager decides an excusable exigency, I think that's how you pronounce that, caused the subpar performance, the imposition of the damages can be waived, but if no such exigency caused the subpar performances, the damages should not be waived. If you put it into your contract, and if there is not a legitimate reason not to apply it, then you shouldn't give the vendor one more chance, one more chance, one more chance. You should apply it. Because not applying it, you have the discretion of is it an excusable delay? If it's an excusable delay, then you waive it because it's an excusable delay. If it is not that circumstance, you waiving it sends a message to the vendor that, well, I can get away with things. If you're starting off the contract or if you're doing this, then it's a clear provision that says if the vendor does or doesn't do something, you will apply liquidated damages, and if you don't do that, then it can get the vendor to thinking, okay, well, I dodged the bullet on that one. Can I dodge any other bullets? Is there anything else I can get away with? Because this person either doesn't know that they were supposed to apply liquidated damages, or is afraid to, or doesn't have the time to, or whatever circumstance. All I know is I'm the contractor. I didn't do something. I was expecting to have to pay damages. I didn't. Well, that's nice. What else can I get away with? Yes?
But Joel, I mean, I don't think the contract manager can just make the decision, you're going to, enforce the liquidated damages. I mean, isn't it like your attorney general also involved in something like this?
Liquidated damages? No.
The contract manager is the person
Yeah.
on the job. I mean, if they're supposed to have, just say they're making building a parking lot, they're supposed to have the parking lot open by a certain date, and if it's not open by a certain date, the contract manager can certainly say, well, you were supposed to have this open on the first of the month. It's the first of the month. It's not open. We're going to start charging these damages every day until the lot is opened. That's the contract manager's call. Absolutely. Because the damages are in the solicitation, the damages are in the contract, everyone knows about it, they've been agreed upon up front, and when it doesn't happen, somebody should just throw the switch and execute those damages.
Well,
There shouldn't be a lot of thought involved, is what I'm saying.
I guess the issue comes down is how clear are the circumstances as to whether the liquidated damages should be triggered. If it's clear, I mean, that's one of the jobs of the contract manager, to know what is supposed to be done, what is being done, what are the remedies available, and in that situation, you should not have to go to the Assistant Attorney General, the procurement officer. You should simply invoke the damages. Now, if you're not sure whether there is an excusable delay and you want to talk to somebody to see about the defensibility of either invoking or not invoking, then you can do that. But it depends how clear-cut it is. If it's clear-cut, they should have done it, there's no reason why they didn't do it, here's the damages, apply it.
You know, and a lot of times they'll see it coming. I mean, the contractor's going to know he's not going to make this date, the state's going to know he's not going to make a certain date. They all know it's on the table, and if it doesn't happen, it's fairly clear-cut in most situations. But he's right, if there's any doubt, then you need some consultation with some other parties. But in most cases, it's very clear-cut when, if they did not perform, and then the damages are invoked.
And that's one of the reasons why you want to have monitoring tools that tip you off as to whether you're going to get to a point in time where something's supposed to be done, and you hopefully don't just find out then it isn't done. That you have this advanced warning that it doesn't look like, so you can start applying more pressure, you can start applying perhaps some of these other remedies, so that hopefully you try to avoid getting to this point. But if it gets here and it's clear-cut, you do it. Yes?
Coming from the private sector into the state sector, sometimes I get confused. I would have thought that as contract manager, what I would do is I would write a note or a call to the procurement officer to notify the contractor that the liquidated damages are being invoked because it's part of the contractual procurement, rather than me, because I'm not a procurement officer, I'm a maintenance chief. So I'm just asking for some clarification. What's the right thing to do?
So your question is whether you're the contract manager and you're not sure whether you have the, but we're saying it's not the procurement officer that does this.
But the procurement officer has to sign the contract. I don't sign the contract.
Right, this is, yeah, right, the procurement, someone's going to sign the contract.
See, and I'm just looking from a legal point of view.
The contract.
It comes down to what responsibilities does the contract manager have? And if part of the responsibilities
See, I don't think I have procurement responsibilities.
Well, that's not procurement.
Okay,
That is
that's
contract management.
Coming from the private sector, the purchasing department at BG&E wound up issuing that documentation.
Well,
not
that's
the engineering staff.
one of the things we say is that you need to work out in advance who has what responsibilities, who's going to pay invoices, because typically the contract manager is the one that approves invoices, not the procurement officer. Now, of course, you can have the same person be both the procurement officer and the contract manager. There is no prohibition against that. That's not usually the way it is, but it doesn't say it can't be. And if you wear both hats, then you have to know, even if you do an action, you have to know which hat are you wearing when you do that action. And you still have to have identified what authority does the contract manager have relative to paying invoices, relative to liquidated damages, relative to any aspect versus MBE compliance, for instance. Who has what responsibility within your agency? And if it's decided that anything like that's going to come from the procurement officer, well then it comes from the procurement officer. But typically, that's not what is done.
You made the statement, within your agency, do you mean to tell me that we have 30 or 40 procurement policies that's a function of agencies rather than a state procurement policy?
The state has procurement law and the state has procurement regulations. But something that I've said is that these law and regulations do not detail every conceivable aspect of contract management. There are many things, there are some things that are beyond the law or regulation that are simply written into the contract, and there are certain things that are not written anywhere. And you have to flesh out by your internal policy, and internal can be either DHMH as a whole, or environment, or general services, or if there's not an overarching departmental policy, then it could be Spring Grove that settles what is your policy at Spring Grove.
Because that's what I bump into, that a policy here is not the same as the policy here.
And it
versus
doesn't
the
say it
policy
has to
there.
be, depending upon how far down you're drilling into the contract management aspects. And I don't know that there should be a standard policy necessarily at a departmental level. Some of these things have to be fleshed out, and it's better to flesh them out ahead of time than to try to figure out what do you do when something occurs. So let's see where I am. We're going to take a break in 3 minutes. Let's see, contract manager decides, sends a bad signal to the contractor to waive a contract provision designed to spur performance. Liquidated damages are supposedly a means to try to get a vendor to perform that is going to cause them harm, meaning cost them money if they don't perform. And if you waive something that is designed to get contract performance, it's sending a bad message. And this is something in particular that my lawyer wanted this to be written, because she's had a lot of experience trying to be involved with the legislative auditors in this situation. If they audit your contract and you have liquidated damages, and they determine that a vendor has not met the requirements, and you did not invoke the liquidated damages, they're going to write you up for it. Now, if you can say there's excusable delay, and that's why you didn't, that's one thing. But if you have no good reason other than, oh, I just thought I should give them another chance, you're going to find yourself on the wrong end of an audit exception. And if that's the motivation for you to do it, well, then that's the motivation to do it. Even though that shouldn't be the reason you do it, you should do it because you should do it. Let's see, i.e., if the agency doesn't enforce this provision, what other contract provisions might the agency not enforce? The contractor might seek to learn what else it can get away with by not performing other provisions and seeing what happens. You're encouraging them to test the waters to see what they can get away with. It's just a bad thing. I'm not saying it's earth-shattering. It may be in some circumstances, but generally it's not the end of the world. But it's just one of these things that you should set the right tone for management, and that's whenever you say there's something that's going to happen, you should have it happen. And then the vendor will get the message. If they don't do what they're supposed to, the things that you've said are going to happen, and they become conditioned to the fact something's going to happen. So they can hopefully become conditioned to the fact they should perform. So with that, why don't you take a break, and we'll come back and talk in 15 minutes.